There was once a little fish called Ruby. When she popped out of her egg, her mummy fish, Mummy Helen, was there to watch her. She loved her very much, although she was very, very forgetful. Sometimes she would forget to brush her teeth. Sometimes she would forget to walk the dogfish. Sometimes she would even forget to give Ruby her gnat larvae dinner. At the beginning, she didn't forget Ruby, although sometimes when she'd say she was going out to the shops or to meet her friends, she would forget the time, and Ruby would be at home waiting for her, feeling worried. One day she said, "I'm just going out, Ruby. Don't worry, I'll be back soon." Ruby waited. Ruby tried not to worry. After all, she'd been told not to. Ruby waited some more. Ruby worried. She couldn't help it. Ruby waited some more. Soon it got dark. Ruby worried some more. Then she found herself a tin of gnat larvae for tea and put herself to bed. Ruby got into bed. Ruby couldn't sleep. She waited and she worried. She worried and she waited. She reminded herself that Mummy had said, "I'm just going out, Ruby. Don't worry, I'll be back soon." Morning came. No Mummy. Ruby's friend Henry came round and asked her to play. "I can't come," said Ruby. "I'm waiting." Evening came. Another night. Another tin of gnat larvae. And a lot more worry. Still no Mummy. Henry came again. "I can't come," said Ruby. "I'm still waiting." Inside she thought, "Mummy said she'll be back." Another night, and Ruby began to think maybe Mummy wasn't coming. Maybe Mummy had forgotten her after all. Another morning, Henry came. He said, "Face it, Ruby, she's not coming back." And Ruby said, "I'm waiting." But after he'd gone, her heart broke in two. She cried. She knew Mummy Helen had forgotten her and wasn't coming back. And then she made a decision. Ruby decided she was never, ever going to feel this horrid again, and she froze over her heart so that it couldn't be hurt again. Now, the best stories have happy endings, and this story does have a happy ending, although it might not end the way you think. Mummy Helen never did come back. She really was very forgetful, and she really had forgotten poor Ruby. However, there were good things ahead for Ruby. First, I'd like you to meet Betty the clownfish. Betty had loved looking after her own little clownfish when they were babies. Now her little clownfish had all grown up and had their own anemones. Betty had space in her heart and her mind and a home for another little fish. She wasn't forgetful. She wasn't a goldfish. One day, Ruby was playing in the park with Henry. Betty saw them and watched Ruby and Henry playing together with pleasure. She saw Henry's mummy pick him up and Ruby swimming off all alone. Betty was worried about who was looking after Ruby, and so she swam to the local school and had a chat with her good friend who was the teacher there, Mrs. Ray. Mrs. Ray looked into it and found that Ruby was living all alone and needed a new mummy. Mrs. Ray knew what a lovely mummy Betty was, and she wondered if Betty might look after Ruby. Betty did a little backflip of joy. She was so excited at the idea of having a little goldfish to care for. So Ruby moved into Betty's anemone. It was pretty. Betty never forgot to give her dinner. She never forgot to kiss Ruby goodnight, and she gave Ruby everything that she needed. Now, I bet you're thinking this is the happy ending, but you've forgotten something. Ruby had frozen her heart so that no one could hurt her ever again. She liked living with Betty. In fact, she loved living with Betty. But because her heart was frozen, she couldn't allow herself to believe that this was really forever and that Betty wouldn't forget her and leave her. One day, Betty had to go and stay with her sister, Chloe Clownfish, who was poorly for a week. She found a nice, safe place for Ruby to stay while she was gone, with a lovely fish called Eileen. Bossy Betty would not leave her precious Ruby with just anyone. She had questioned and questioned Eileen to check she knew how to look after Ruby properly. She had asked the other children Eileen looked after to check they had a lovely time. She might even have spied on Eileen to check she was nice when no one was watching. But if she did, I couldn't possibly say. Even so, Betty was sad to leave Ruby behind. As she went, she said, "I'm going away, But don't worry, I'll be back soon, Ruby thought. I've heard that before. Look how that ended last time. And so Ruby decided she was not going to do the worrying and the waiting and the worrying again. Betty was gone. Ruby was sad, but she thought, I'll just have to get on with it and look after myself. She was very, very good, almost too good for a child. She did everything Eileen told her. It was really important to her that Eileen liked her. She knew she needed a kind grown-up. Every so often her heart would tremble when it remembered Mummy Betty. Ruby could not bear the feeling of her heart hurting, so she gulped down the feeling and pretended it wasn't there. She looked happy, but she wasn't really. Ruby didn't expect Betty to come back. Why would she? Ruby had learnt as a tiny fish that mummies don't remember children, and you can't trust them to be there when you need them. Can you guess what happened next? Betty wasn't away long. When she came back, she held out her fins towards Ruby with joy. And at first, Ruby was overjoyed to see her and swam towards her. And then Ruby was cross. How could Betty have gone and made her heart so sad? Didn't she care? Didn't she understand? Ruby turned tail on Betty and she didn't want to talk. Eileen told Betty how happy Ruby had seemed. Betty tried to talk to Ruby about all the nice things she'd done with Eileen. This just made Ruby crosser and crosser and crosser until she exploded with crossness. She thrashed around in their anemone, breaking everything. Betty tried to reassure her that she loved her and would be there for her. But the more she did this, the crosser and more thrashy Ruby became. Didn't Betty understand how much Ruby's heart had hurt? How terrified she had been that she'd lost her forever? Surely if she'd understood, she would never have gone. But Ruby couldn't explain this in words, and all her upset just came out as a loud, thrashy noise. And Betty was confused. Just then, a wise old turtle Tudor swam past. Betty was just outside the anemone with her head in her fins. Inside there was a lot of noise. Betty explained to Tudor what was going on. Tudor thought for a bit, and then he said, Maybe she couldn't believe that you were really coming back. Maybe her heart was breaking inside because her goldfish mummy taught her that mummies forget their children. She didn't know that you could never, ever forget her, and that your mummy's love really is forever. So, once the thrashing had stopped, Betty talked to Ruby. She told her she understood that Ruby really had believed she wasn't coming back, and how very sorry she was that she'd had to go. And that's when it started. Ruby began to believe, just about, that maybe, perhaps, really, Betty might be her mummy forever. At first she only believed it in one tiny fin, but slowly, over time, as Betty showed Ruby that she understood about the frozen heart and Ruby's need to push her away sometimes, the belief started to spread. And eventually those feelings spread to Ruby's heart, and the heart defrosted, and Mummy Betty's love sewed it back together again until it was stronger than before. The end.